I hate you. I hate you. Oh, okay. My name's Dave. No, you don't understand. I hate you. I hate everything you do. I hate everything you stand for. I hate who you are. I hate what you're doing to my church and the way you might make it like that other church that you used to be at. I hate you. It's nice to meet you. What was your name? This is a conversation I had recently, and it reminded me of so many other conversations I've had in the past where somebody will run up to me and just, in the effort or in a desire to be authentic or something, just tell me what a piece of garbage I am because of the way I do church. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're like, this sounds so great, Dave gets to do all these wonderful things, what an amazing life he must have, you're right. I do have an amazing life. I feel very fortunate and privileged and grateful and thankful to God. But there's a cost. Man, you're just gonna take it in the shin every now and then. Sometimes from a little girl after you're done preaching. By little girl, I mean somebody in their mid-20s. Sometimes from older church ladies, sometimes from anybody. And rarely has anything been more of a lightning rod than my preferences and beliefs on design. The Chapter House, for example, was built in 1888. It's a Victorian manor house, Elizabethan manor house. And when we bought it, it was pretty run down. It was a psychiatrist's office, and they'd made some efforts to restore it to sort of Victorian quality, but it looked like a dentist office. I mean, it had industrial carpet everywhere, which is gross. It had gray walls everywhere, which is gross. It had drop ceilings and fluorescent lights, which are gross. And, of course, you might have gray carpet and gray walls and fluorescent lights, and you're going, hey, now. I go, I know, I'm sorry. We all have our different, design preferences and aesthetics. Yours are gross. It's gross. It's offensive. I don't want anything to look like a hospital, especially not if I have to go to the hospital. I mean, the reason hospitals are designed like that is so you can tell if there's blood or something else coming out of a person's body. We ought to have other tells other than just the color of the walls and the illumination to know if somebody's dying in front of us. So when we come to church or in the place of the Chapter House, the least concerns I have is someone soiling the bed. The bigger concerns I have are how do we minister to people? How do we help people make connections? How do we look after people? How do we ignite dreams inside of people? And so the Chapter House is really designed to stimulate dreams. And every inch of the house has been lovingly curated to provoke new passions and new ideas. And it is an homage, really, to my preferences in design, but also to my mentor and my friend, Leonard Sweet. The Chapter House is a poor man's version of his homes on Orcas Island in the Salish Sea, and where his houses are filled with, Rembrandts, my houses are filled with little signs that remind you of what I believe, that this world may have forces of decay in it, but thanks be to God, he sent you to stop the decay and do something else. Make it beautiful, make it sweet, make it fun, make it great, make it cool. You are God's response to a culture of fragmentation and despair. You are God's emissary, God's ambassador, reminding the world that things are meant to be more than what they are. And with God's help and for God's glory, we can make it that way. So the house really is a mission statement. It's my heart writ large, and I feel very proud of it. I would love for you to come and see us sometime and join with us, and where we talk about stuff like we do on this podcast, except I talk a lot less when you're at the house, and I smoke a lot more cigars, drink a lot more whiskey and coffee and pet dogs, and we laugh. And then, of course, there's plenty of great ministry times and crying and eating and all that good stuff. Aesthetics are the ultimate apologetics. I mean, I've been in ministry for, I don't know, since I was 14 years old. I think I was 14 when I led my first Bible study. So you lead something, let's call that you're being in ministry. And so that's a long time. It's a long time. And I used to really prioritize the intellect only. I thought if I could out-argue people, if I could rationalize my way out of any conversation, if I could defeat them in debate, then my ministry would be proved effective. And the truth is, I won a lot of debates, and I made a lot of people second-guess their beliefs because their beliefs were fragile and inconsequential. And I led very few people to Jesus that way, and I lost a lot of friends that way. And apologetics tends to attract the antagonist. And I think if we're going to contend for the veracity and the worth of our faith, there has to be a better way to do it than just having better arguments than the other guy. And that's not to say that all apologeticists are mean-spirited or whatever, just that I didn't do it right. I was bad at it. I mean, I was good at it in that I didn't lose. I was bad at it in that I didn't win. But what I've learned over the years, through my college ministry, and then definitely through the years that I had working in local church ministry as a lead pastor, and now especially through the chapter house, is that creating and cultivating environments and experiences of transcendent beauty and otherworldly grace invite people to curiously investigate the divine. And when they're the ones that have a holy longing in their hearts, and when they're the ones that are asking questions, and when they're the ones that are asking, what about this, and what about this, and how come this, and how come that, when their hearts are expanding, they're taking on a posture of curiosity, the heart of a learner, the heart of a disciple, and one of the beauties of something that's beautiful, that's a stupid sentence, but you get what I mean. One of the glories of something beautiful is that it continues to unfold like a flower, and there's just new beauty with every layer of complexity, and it keeps people questing and journeying, and that means that through the portion of my ministry where I was prioritizing design and still to this day prioritizing aesthetics and design, I've led so many more people into a meaningful relationship with Jesus Christ, and my own faith has been deepened and enriched, and the lives of the people around me have been deepened and enriched. So in my life, this maxim has been proven true, that aesthetics are the ultimate apologetic. And that's because God is a designer. I mean, God is first revealed to us as a creator in Genesis 1 and 2. God is a poet. God is a potter. God is an artist. God is a spokesperson. I mean, God makes things and God makes things up. And you and I have been made by God to be like God. We're here to make things up and make things new and make things fresh and working together for the renewal of all things. This is our great and holy calling. God is a creator, and we have been created by the Creator to perpetuate God's creation. How amazing. And so when we design things, whether that's artistically or in business principles, because, aesthetics and innovation are kind of the two arms, of creativity, lots of which I've written about on Fossores.com. But really, when we get into all of this, we're echoing, we're shadowing, we're emulating our Creator, and the results are great. And I don't even know how to start really a podcast on design. I've got a new book that's coming out in Q2 of 2024 called Christian Innovation and Design. It's a daily devotional about paying the price in ministry. Actually, that's the old title. The new title is Broken Teeth and Bloody Smiles, which is a way better title. It talks about the cost of being creative in Christian ministry. And so we talk about lots of these principles here, but for today, I thought we'll go through at light speed some examples of what I believe about design and some of the great stories and experiences that we've had with design. I'll start with a manifesto on sacerdotal design, and then we'll talk a little bit about environment design, experiential design, interactives. Then we'll talk a little bit about storytelling in design. I better write that down on my notes so I don't forget. And then last but not least, if you've got the bandwidth for it, I will share with you some of the most skipped over pages of Then, Now, Next, a biblical vision of the church, the kingdom, and the future. One of the great books that I read, that I wrote. But from page 498 to page 512 in that book is the secret sauce of interactivity that most people sort of get into and then kind of glaze over because it's a bit dense. And so I'll tease that out for you, but we'll do that at the very end. So if you're already chock full of design ideas, you don't have to kill yourself. Keep listening to that. Anyway, let's start with a manifesto on sacerdotal design. I've been looking at the way churches do design. And it seems like there's a whole bunch of churches that haven't yet got their act together. I jokingly refer to those as the churches that are still in the Bush League and they want to go pro. So if you're a Bush Leaguer and you want to go pro, you got to learn the basics of great design. And I'm talking about the churches where you walk in and there's a big cardboard box full of leftover candles from last year's Christmas Eve service on the front row. Or you go look at their announcement board or their bulletin board and, there's stuff up there from 3 sermon series ago, or there's 4 different logos, or some stuff's color and some stuff's black and white, or, they're announcing the funeral of somebody who died in 1973. I mean, you're like, what are you guys doing? Do you even care? I mean, you go into the bathroom and there's a bar of soap on the counter, but it hasn't been unwrapped. And, it just, everything's a mess. You try and find coffee in there and there's one little pot, but it's on the ground because the extension cord's not long enough. I mean, these are guys that, they just haven't got some stuff figured out. So for these guys, for the Bush Leaguers, I go, here's some basics of good design. First, Good design is cohesive, bringing together color, texture, shape, alignment, proportion, and diction. Meaning, just think through how things go together. Pick a color palette. Go to adobecooler.com, pick a color palette, stick with it. Make sure that you got the same family of colors from your auditorium through to your lobby. Make sure you got the same fonts throughout the church. No Scotch tape and no signs made on a printer ever. I mean, just like the basic stuff. Good design is immersive, meaning when you walk into the church, you feel like you're going into one place. I mean, remember, when you're in the mall and you go into American Eagle, it feels like you're in a new store. You leave, and then you go into Hot Topic. It feels like you're in a new store. You leave, you go into Jamba Juice. It feels like you're in a new store. When people get out of the parking lot and they get into your church, it ought to feel like they're in one place. They ought not to look at Hot Topic in front of them and then Jamba Juice beside them with no space separating them. They certainly ought not to be bringing their infants and toddlers to Hot Topic so that they can go get Jamba Juice communion. I mean, that's all a disaster. So just bring it all together and make it feel like one piece. Make it immersive. And the best design when you talk about an auditorium is you want to try and think not just about what's on the stage, but you want to think about the whole 360 experience. You want to think about the walls, you want to think about the floors, you want to think about the ceilings, you want to think about the back walls, the doors, the windows, everything. Just make it immersive. And I like to think of that immersive quality of design as the difference between a Broadway play, which is just about what happens on the stage, or going to the Wizarding World of Harry Potter in Orlando, where as you walk in through the gates, you feel like you're in Hogsmeade or you're in Hogwarts. I mean, you're surrounded by the world of Harry Potter, and you feel like you're a character in the play. Allow people to feel like they're the main character in the story of your church, or they're the best supporting actor as they shadow God and walk with Jesus. Good design is adaptive, meaning we adopt other people's ideas and incorporate familiar elements, just with an unexpected twist. So if you're not sure how to be a designer and you go, man, we really want to copy the branding guidelines of the Nike headquarters, sure, go for it. Just put something in there that's a little bit your own, and make sure that the something in there that's a little bit your own is consistent throughout. Good design is multisensory, meaning it's not just about what you see, but it's also about the textures and the colors. It's about the feel of it. It's about the temperature. It's about the way things smell. I mean, sometimes you can have a great looking church that smells like feet. That's a bad experience for somebody. I mean, if you come into church and there's a stank, there's a musty, wet cat kind of odor throughout the place, that's a big turnoff. And you can tell me, God isn't concerned with those kind of things, but I'm pretty sure he is. I'm pretty sure God doesn't like the stink. And I suppose if we really had to swashbuckle over that, I could tell you about all the ritualistic purity laws in Leviticus, which were instituted by God and ostensibly serve God's design preferences and aesthetic. We could talk about the way that God is using incense and the way that God is talking about the lavers of cleansing, or the way that the temple had to be washed off, or the altar had to be washed off. I mean, but we don't need to do all that. It's gross. I mean, the place stinks. Get some air fresheners in there and be aware of the fact that those things turn people off. And it's such a distraction that people can't have a meaningful experience of God and worship because it smells bad. Anyway, good design requires craftsmanship. And I like Robert Maida's definition, the former president of the Rhode Island School of Design, that craftsmanship means working like you care. So good design means you care. So if there's trim going along the floor between the hardwood floor and the walls, make sure that the trim lines up. Make sure that the nail holes have been spackled over. Make sure that the top of the trim has been caulked or used, wood filler or whatever. Just make it matter. If you're going to put something on the screens, make sure that the visual of the screens goes to the edges of the screen. Make sure there aren't any typos in your overhead lyrics. And you say, well, Dave, this is pretty nitpicky. Hey, man, I'm just telling you what it's like for somebody to come and visit your church. And if you're coming in there and you're going to entrust this church with the most sacred and holy parts of who you are, you want to know that they care. And when you got bad typos and you got incorrect times on your website and service starts 10 minutes late, all that communicates is none of this really matters. It's really not that big a deal. And your soul is a really big deal. The immortal condition of your metaphysical self actually pretty friggin' hugely matters. So if these people don't care about typos, I don't know how you're going to entrust them with your soul. Somebody one time said something, faithful with a little, entrusted with much. Faithless with a little, entrusted with less. I mean, if you can't take care of spell check, you probably can't take care of my kids. Anyway, those are the basics of great design. Then there's churches that they want to kind of go to the next level. You know, they've got all the basics figured out. They're on their way to becoming a mega church. You know, they're the next seeker sensitive whatever. And they realize that they're basically just doing a TED Talk with some cutesy music. So if you're a professional church and you're doing TED Talks with cutesy music and you're going, man, this doesn't feel like New Testament church. This doesn't feel like we're doing real ministry. We're polished, we're professional, but I just don't know if I believe in what we're offering anymore. Well, then you really want to go to the next level in design, which I think of as prophetic design. Now, these titles, of course, in some way are arbitrary, but by prophetic, I really mean you're comparing the way the world is with the way the world ought to be. This was primarily the function of the prophets in the Old Testament. They didn't just speak oracles or foretell the future. Far more frequently, instead of foretelling, they were forthtelling. They were speaking to the kings. They were speaking to the people saying, hey, something about the way we live now isn't the way God wants. And God's mad, and God will be pleased if we make the appropriate changes. And so if you're at church and you're going, this just doesn't quite line up, and we need to make some changes in order for God to be pleased, in order for God to be glorified, in order for ministry to happen in our church, then this is the next level of prophetic design. Great design is prophetic, meaning it confronts our reality with reality as God intends. So we ought to be prophetic in the realms of finance, help, justice and advocacy, charity. We ought to be prophetic in the local issues in our community, prophetic with politics. I hesitate to say politics because, if there's a Democratic government right now, you're going to be upset and hope that a Republican government gets elected or vice versa. And look, God has no political party. I think I speak with confidence when I say, no matter what country in the world you're in, no matter what time you're in human history, every political party is flawed, and it wouldn't be any better if you were involved. Like politics is kind of making the best of it. And that's true whether you're in Canada or the United States or Cuba or Germany or Japan or Kenya. Just the problem to the ailment of the world is not, or pardon me, the solution to the ailments of the world is not to vote in the correct party. The solution is to hold the people who are in power to a higher standard so that while they're in power, they can do better. And you say, well, shouldn't we vote them out, Dave, if they're criminal? Of course. I'm glad the Nazis didn't stay in power longer. That's a bad idea, of course. But I think the church puts a disproportionate amount of effort on getting the right people elected. And never in human history has that been effective. Case in point, with the National Socialist Party in Germany, who were largely seen as a Christian party. Or the apartheid government in South Africa, who were largely seen as a Christian party. Every time we get Christian governments in charge of Christian nations, something really bad happens and a whole bunch of people are killed and suffer for it. So let's not get all excited about the next Christian party and the next Christian candidate and the next Christian president. I'm far less concerned with what they call themselves than with how they live and how they lead. So let's hold people to that standard rather than just, white labeling everybody who we think is good because they say they're Baptist or something. All right. Good design is provocative, meaning it's got to stir within the people feelings of yearning and longing and possibility. I remember an interview I did once with the social media pastor of an exceptionally large church that everybody would know. And of course, I'm not going to name her or I'm not going to name the church. But she said, you know what keeps you from growing faster, David? What's that? You won't tell people they're right. If you just got up there and said, Christians are right about just about everything. In fact, you are right in the prejudices you have, in the biases you have, in the way you think things should go. If more people just did what we as Christians do, the world would be a better place. She said, you could grow like hotcakes. So the problem is you're constantly provoking people. And you're constantly asking people to re-examine. And when you ask people to re-examine and they take you seriously, it arrests momentum. It turns them inward. It causes them to make change. And it's really hard to build momentum and gain steam when everybody on your team is asking themselves, am I really sure I'm doing it right? Well, I thought the life of a Christian was a constant metanoia. I mean, I really think that as a lover and follower of Jesus, I got to be constantly examining my heart. So I think the church ought to do that too. We ought to provoke people and go, are you sure? Is this really what God wants? Why don't we check with the Holy Spirit? Why don't we go to God in prayer? I mean, constantly. I think good design is provocative. And maybe that slows down our momentum a little bit, but that's okay. The sheep need to be sheared. And sometimes you're the sheep and sometimes you're the shearer. But in all things, we serve the shepherd. So let's just be good about the fact that we're going to have to poke and we're going to have to prod a little bit, like Jesus, like John the Baptist, like the Apostle Paul, like John the Revelator, like Isaiah, like Jeremiah, certainly like Ezekiel, like Daniel. I mean, ours is a voice of prophetic reorientation. We are a people of godly and noble critique. That's how we're meant to be. All right. Good design is narrative, meaning we tell a story about us here, now, and about where we're going. Again, in one of the other episodes of the podcast, I introduced you to my storytelling rubric that I often use, that I adapted from, or that I developed out of Robert McKee's book, Storytelling. But every time I use the term story, in my mind, the starting place is to think about a desire that somebody has, the actions they take to fulfill that desire, the resistance that they encounter that keeps them from getting what they want right away, and then finally the kick or the consummation that takes them into the next episode of the story or of their life. And I use the acronym DARK for all that, desire, action, resistance, and kick. And so when we say good design is narrative, I go, sure, what's your dark for the auditorium? What's your dark for the social media strategy? What's your dark for the site plan? How do those all work together? What's the mission of the church, the vision, the values, your target? What's the dark that pulls all those things together? Good design is multisensory, engaging all learning styles and all types of intelligence. The church is always going to have some visual, audible, and kinesthetic component to it. But just because we use different types of learning That doesn't mean that we're specifically targeting different types of intelligence. There's a spatial intelligence, there's a linguistic intelligence, there's an athletic intelligence, there's a creative intelligence. Howard Gardner, in his book Frames of Mind, is, of course, the progenitor of the multiple intelligence theory, and I found that a very helpful way to think through who we engage and how deeply we engage them in these design principles. And last but not least, good design is localized, building bridges between your zip code in the kingdom of eternality. Look, if you're in a country western town, you got to have a country western church that presents a country western gospel. Now, if in your town God has called you to reach the small goth subculture, well, then you got to have a small goth subculture with a country western overtone in your ministry. Of course, I'm being facetious about just how specific that is. But really what I'm saying is don't copy somebody from Los Angeles and try and take their formula for ministry and apply it to Jackson, Michigan, or Parma or Concord or something like that. It's just not going to work, man. What works over there isn't necessarily going to work over here. What works for them isn't necessarily going to work for you. The reason that God has you here now with them, with these people that God has entrusted into your care, is because you're the person God thinks can figure it out. And you don't figure it out by copying off of somebody else's exam paper. You figure it out by doing the work of exegeting the culture, learning the people, getting in deep. Now, as I talk about all that, I encourage you, especially if you're in a church of, 1,500 to 3,000, to just ask yourself, how true are these adjectives of my church? Is my church prophetic? Is my church provocative? Is my church telling a story? Is my church participatory? Is my church localized? Or is my church sort of like the local Walmart mega church in my town? And I think if you're experiencing the Walmartization of your church, if you feel like you got a cookie cutter big box store and you could really walk into any mega church and they're doing the same playbook, then maybe there's an opportunity for you to grow. And you go, well, Dave, what do you mean by grow? Because that consultant gal told you that's what keeps you from growing. I don't necessarily mean adding the next couple hundred consumer Christians to your fourth Sunday morning service. I mean, how are you going to make things more beautiful, more true, more good, like Thomas Aquinas teased out in his 3 Transcendentals of Being? I mean, how are you going to actually believe in what you're doing? How are you going to stand before God and say, I'm really proud of what I did? How are you going to look your kids in the face and go, this was really great? The quality of it matters. Now, there are churches that do great ministry. They do really exceptional ministry, like what I've just described in the prophetic design piece. And they wonder what to do next. It's not so much that they feel as though they've got everything figured out. They just go, in the same way that we went from Bush League to pro, and they can kind of look back on that and sort of, reminisce about the good old days of pop-up church and church trailers and all that stuff. Now that they figured some things out, and then they figured out how to do some real ministry so that even as they grew, it became meaningful. They go, what's next? Like, what else does God have in store for us? These are the things that I think of as sacerdotal. And sacerdotal is a fancy word that means priestly, and I just mean like these issues and incorporate all the others, and they're specifically focused on creating a meaningful experience with God. I mean, so it's not just that each individual piece is prophetic or provocative, or that we have the courage and the boldness to cut against the grain or kick against the goads or whatever. But now we bring it all together to create a sort of cohesive whole in which each liturgy or each experience feels like what you might experience if you were going to an underground theater or a special presentation or a curated show, but from a great artist, or a once-in-a-lifetime concert experience, and so that you really have that wow factor, but instead of people just being dazzled, their relationship with God is deepened. And I think this sacerdotal design has these qualities. First, great design is sacramental, mediating the human and the divine, drawing people into the presence of God. And by sacramental, I mean the actual sacraments. I mean baptism, confession, ordination, holy orders. Of course, we're probably not offering a bunch of different marriages, but the Eucharist. And I want you to think about how you can do those things differently. And instead of just doing them perfunctorily or making sure they happen and they happen beautifully and nicely, I want you to think about how you can take the whole entire service and make the whole experience an experience of baptism for everybody, not just the baptismal candidates. I want you to think about how confession gets woven into the warp and the woof of your church, such that confession is a regular part of the rhythm of people's lives. And also, there's opportunity for you to explore new sacraments and new ritualizations of faith. And that's the second thing. Good design is elemental. Meaning we engage with the traditional elements of religious ritual. Now, if you're getting lost here and it sounds too gobbledygooky, I apologize. But really what I'm saying is that Christian people all over the planet for thousands of years have dealt with some raw materials we all have in common: bread and wine, fire and ash, smoke, flame, incense. These are the things that the elements, like these are the actual tangible things that make people feel spiritual. You go into a Hindu temple, you have these. You go into a Sikh temple, you have these. You go into Notre Dame or a Catholic church, you have these. You go into a local church in Tibet or Thailand or the Philippines. You go somewhere in the jungle in India, you have these things. And so in North America, we have lights and lasers and smoke machines and gobos and cutouts and prisms. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Those things are cool. Those things are great. But they don't feel spiritual. They feel like performance. Now, I'm not an anti-performance person. I think the whole diatribe about talking about how worship has become a performance and boo-hoo, blah, blah, I think that's misplaced. I just think there's something more than a performance. I think performance is a great pro-church level, but let's go deeper. Come on, let's get prophetic. Let's get sacerdotal. Let's get into the good stuff, man. Let's move past copy and cold play and get into something completely other, where we create meaningful spiritual experiences through design. And again, one good way to do that is to replace your lights and lasers with fire, ash, and wine. Good design is evocative, prioritizing mood and myth and feeling, not proposition or doctrine or dogma. This is a controversial one, like so many of these things about design, but I don't think that Sunday morning is the time to force feed people the correct beliefs. I do think there's absolutely a place in the church to help people understand the finer points of doctrine and dogma. I just don't think Sunday morning with a mixed age, mixed group is the right time to do that. It's not an effective time. And you're there gathered to have a spiritual experience. Spiritual experiences are best facilitated by questions, observations, storytelling, an open-ended sense of wonder, of curiosity, of availability to the Spirit of God, of possibility, of imagination. That's how you get people to open up into the greatness and largesse of God. But telling them the right answer all the time, here's 6 things you need to know about a biblical marriage. Biblical manhood, it's ABC. Biblical womanhood, that's 1, 2, 3. I mean, you get so rigid like that, and you take the glory and the complexity of our faith and you turn it into an Excel spreadsheet. And yeah, a couple people can memorize it and a few people can take notes and maybe some people are edified, but in the end, you're just left with Poindexter Presbyterians. I mean, there's no life there. There's no hope there. There's just some folks who memorized a couple of drop-down menus on their Bible app, and it's dull and lifeless. There's something more. And so I'm not deprioritizing doctrine. I'm just saying it's just not, Sunday morning is not the right environment for that. I shouldn't say not the right, I should say Sunday morning is not the most helpful environment for that. That's not where it's going to take the deepest root. And last but not least, good design is transcendent, meaning we want people to experience an uncommon level of beauty, truth, and goodness. We want them to get caught up in the presence of God. We want them to feel as though the congealed presence of God is all around them, that God is in our midst, that God is moving, that every single person there is in touch with the Holy Ghost. Every single person in the room is operating in their gifts, is able to meander through the meeting with a sense of great confidence. So anyway, that's a manifesto on sacerdotal design with the 3 tiers: great design, prophetic design, sacerdotal design. And I just think there's lots there for all of us to explore. And you may have other things that I haven't even touched on, but we're only just getting started. So here's some of my favorite stories or some of my favorite experiments. Again, I'll break it up into environmental design, experiential design, and interactives. Environmental design is the things in which you abide. One of my favorites was we were doing a series on Jeremiah, and we turned our whole entire auditorium into a Bedouin tent. We hung these huge sailcloths from the center of the auditorium all the way out to the side walls so that when you looked up, it felt like you were in a big tent. And then we lit torches and braziers all around the inside of the auditorium so that you had this kind of Middle Eastern feel to it. And then the piece de la resistance was we took out all the chairs in the auditorium and we replaced it with I don't even remember, 4,000, a stupid amount of numbers of pillows. So instead of chairs, we just had pillows all over the floor. And our musicians were playing different instruments, and then everything had kind of a Middle Eastern feel. And I was so proud of this. I thought this was amazing. People were coming into this worship service in a tent in the desert to talk about a desert prophet after his city had been destroyed. And it was a disaster. It was a disaster because I didn't take into consideration the fact that not everybody could get up and down and sit on the ground. And so you had people who had bad hips and bad knees who were like that. I just can't do that, David. So people were unstacking chairs and our ushers were trying to help everybody. So then you just end up having chairs on top of pillows and then the chairs were tipping over and it was a disaster. It was an ableist's folly. I felt so stupid and so foolish. And so after the first Sunday, of course, we took out all the pillows, or we left pillows in for a few people at the front. But it was a gong show, man. And I hurt so many people with that just by not. It was a complete blind spot. I mean, I just had so many people say, "I can't believe you didn't think of me, or you didn't care about me," and I just didn't. I was so dumb. So it looked really cool until, we had to actually use it. And then the function was a disaster. We've done lots of experiments with having church in the round or church in different seating environments. We've done things where we gave people cans of spray paint and invited them to spray paint the walls and spray paint the carpet. And that kind of created a chaotic, fun environment. We did things in the room where we had some folks that were joining us from Egypt, and they could write in hieroglyphics. So we had big hieroglyphic messages all over the walls, and they were writing hieroglyphics in real time. One of my favorite services is we set up everybody in tricliniums. A triclinium is a U-shaped table common in the first century. And so when you hear the old story about how people wouldn't just sit down in chairs like we have them now, but back in the first century, they would recline on couches around the table, and they would sort of have their bodies close to where the food was, and then their legs would kind of stick out, and that whole configuration was a U-shaped configuration with a space in the middle. So think, like 3 park benches kind of thing, either side, and then sort of a hat on top. And then what would happen is the servers would come into the middle of that U-shaped triclinium, and they would serve food, and performers would come into the middle of that triclinium, and they would recite poetry, or they would sing or perform music. Teachers would come and stop by. And when God talks about being in our midst, I think the best way to conceptualize that is God being in the center of the triclinium. And this is likely how Jesus and his friends would have celebrated the Last Supper, because it's the typical way that they ate. So we set up the whole auditorium in tricliniums, and then we had people move in and around the spaces of the tricliniums, serving almost like a restaurant, our people, the Eucharist, and some teaching moments, some prayer, and some anointing. And that was a really cool thing. Another great environmental design we had was we had a huge cross suspended from the ceiling on chain drivers. So we could change the angle and the pitch of the cross so you could get sort of a completely flat cross, almost like a dinner table cross, or a completely erect cross in the way that we're typically used to seeing it, or a cross on an angle, or a cross askew. And those chain drivers made this really alarming noise, so you could raise and lower the cross. And we did all kinds of sermon illustrations with that, which was really meaningful. And on Good Friday, we had everybody, write on strips of paper and in red ink, write down what their sins were that they were, wanting to be forgiven through the death of Jesus. And then we had the cross down like a table, and we all took communion on top of the cross in different stations. And then on Easter Sunday, we raised the cross so it was erect, and all the strips of white linen that people had written their sins on had been washed, and all the red ink had come out, so now their sins were white as snow, and it was just a neat thing. It made really cool shadows on the people, and I don't know, in the short course of my life, how many times I've done some version of write your sin and stick it to the cross kind of interactives. Lots and lots and lots. But the size of this cross and the addition of the disappearing ink made it all really special. And being able to take communion on top of the cross while we talked about the death of Jesus was cool. Anyway, there's lots that you can do with designing an environment. And again, the sort of the way to think about that environment is to think about it like the Wizarding World of Harry Potter or Star Wars at Disney. How do we get people into this completely other space? And you go, well, Dave, how can we do that? That can be really expensive. It can be really expensive, but it can also be really inexpensive. We did that for years and years and years with a very small budget, $500 a year. Because we would reuse materials, or people would donate materials, or we would find materials at thrift stores or look for things that were being given away. This was before a Facebook Marketplace, but that makes it even easier. But you really want to create an immersive, environmental 360 experience for people, so that they remember it, they remark upon it, so that it affects them. There's also some experiential design. These are things that you do, things like prayer labyrinths, which we've done tons of prayer labyrinths. We have a prayer labyrinth at the Chapter House right now that I really love. We also have some prayer labyrinths in the basement catacombs of the Chapter House, where you can trace the labyrinth with your finger and sort of go through the inward journey. But in one of the early prayer labyrinths that I did, you got to such and such a station, and you would read into a microphone a passage of Scripture. And that passage of Scripture was proclaiming hope and healing over somebody. You're speaking as God in reading in this Scripture, and you're just reading that. And as you proceeded through the labyrinth, one of the other stations had just a pair of headphones, and you'd put on the headphones, and somebody else would be reading that Scripture, the Scripture that you had already read, over top of you. And so then you had this sort of echo chamber effect that just like you were speaking words of hope and healing, somebody else was speaking words of hope and healing. And with the measure you give, you will receive, so on and so forth. And we did a lot of the really common things. We had everybody take garbage out of their purse or whatever their leftover stuff was from their coats, and had artists put it all together in bricolage. And we had big murals on the back wall of the church at one point, that represented the kind of 6 movements of Scripture, sort of rhyming episodes from Old and New Testament. So like Babel and Pentecost had an icon that brought those 2 episodes together. The flood and Jesus' baptism, creation and new creation, Adam and the second Adam, Jesus Christ, the tribes, the 12 tribes, and the 12 apostles. We just these ways of bringing together these pairs and seeing ourselves in the whole story. And then we invited people to sort of journal on that art piece and see where they saw themselves and why that was meaningful. We also did lots of QR codes in our copy of the draft. That was our bulletin. QR codes in lots of our publications, QR codes on the screen, QR codes in cutouts, just any way to make things interactive, any way to give people agency. We did virtual tours throughout the church on MP3 players, or, remember those old things. And now we just use QR codes as a way for people to do it. One of my favorite experiential things was we had a yearly covenantal renewal for our church, for all our we called them owners, but members or partners or whatever. And so we said, if you want to spend a year with us, here's the things that you're committing to. And so we called it our creed. And, it started out, I give myself to the journey of knowing Jesus and his way, to joining arms with the people of our church and locking arms with our community for the good of the world. It's this kind of thing, just basic profession of faith sorts of things that prioritize mission in the community. Well, we had everybody write this out on this huge tarp, and then everybody sign it and put their thumbprint on it and fingerprints and all the rest of it. And we were just getting started with a series about Hosea and Gomer. And we were going to use a mannequin as a prop for this sermon series. And as I was preaching, I was going to be the prophet Hosea, and I was going to speak to this mannequin Gomer, and she was going to kind of be my silent partner on stage. And, throughout the book of Hosea, Gomer says just about nothing. And so this speechless, inanimate mannequin was a really great stand-in. I wanted people to get the sense that we all have those times in our faith where we have something to say and nothing comes back at us, or we have all these questions, or we have all this hurt, or we have all this frustration, and nothing comes back at us, either from God or from this lifeless woman. And so we thought, well, why don't we decoupage the mannequin with this creed, the creed of our church. And so we took this tarp and we cut it up into strips and we laid it all over the mannequin. And then it was this really amazing prophetic kind of message, because we were acknowledging the fact that as a church, we were going to be silent sometimes when people needed answers. And as a church, we were going to screw it up like Gomer screwed it up. And there were going to be times that we weren't sufficient. And so we had this real problem or this real acknowledgement of our own complicity to be part of the problem. So we had this Gomer mannequin, and then it was only up for a little while. So we put it on display in the auditorium, and people could come and see it in between services. And then we noticed all the little boys of the church kept running up and touching her boobs. So they would honk her boobs and pinch her nipples and run away laughing. And so this was getting to be a real problem. I couldn't stop laughing. I still can't stop laughing about it. But, their moms were upset, and people thought, well, maybe we should cover up. I mean, they were paper mache boobs, and you couldn't really see anything except the basic shape of boobs, which I think everybody has. But anyway, so we thought, okay, well, we better respond to this complaint because I can't concentrate because I get the giggles. So we thought, well, rather than just taking the mannequin down, or rather than putting some clothes on it or whatever, because that seems goofy and beside the point, let's cut the boobs out and replace them with a mirror. And so then you get sort of the added shock of the fact that we've just sort of mutilated this woman because she doesn't fit into our Christian sensitivities of gender. And we had all these highfalutin ideas about why that was a good idea to poke people on. And then you could further see that you yourself are part of the problem. I'm part of the problem. Everybody who stares at Gomer is part of the problem. Also, how come you're always staring at her chest? Ha ha ha. So that was really effective for a week or two. And then another group of little boys decided that since we'd taken the boobs away, they would play with other parts of Gomer. So then they were exploring the South Pole. And at that point, we thought, I give up. So we had to take Gomer out and hide the mannequin for forever. But that will always be funny to me, is that what started out as this really, I thought, great art piece and this great way to illustrate a manuscript, this poor woman just got molested. And just, you bunch of dirty perverts. All those little boys and all those people that hurt that mannequin, you're grown men now, and shame on you, you dirty porn freaks who just don't you know how to treat a woman. Gosh, she was vilified. And you know what, Hosea? I'm not sure you were any better. I digress. Anyway, we did lots of stuff with prayer labyrinths. One of my favorite things, that was a quick segue. One of my favorite things that we made, we called it the garden path. And we were thinking a little bit about the Festival of Booths and the book of Ecclesiastes. And in the Festival of Booths, historically, Jewish people would erect temporary shelters, as a way to talk about the fact that nothing lasts, nothing is forever. We need to enjoy things for their temporary goodness as foreshocks of eternity. And so we had different people in our church make booths outside, and one was kind of like a greenhouse, and one was kind of like a jungle gym, and one was a prayer labyrinth and a maze, and we called it the garden path. And you could walk the garden path and do different prayer exercises and meaningful activities in each of these things. And they were out in the garden, and that was really cool, man. That was really cool. So anyway, that's some environmental design. That's some experiential design. Now let's talk about interactives. which are little spiritual exercises that we often use in the room, prayer stations. And really, these were popularized way back in the day of the emerging church and with Dan Kimball and Vintage Faith Church, Doug Padgett and Solomon's Porch. I mean, prayer interactives were the big hit once upon a time, but they're really just ways to Catholicize evangelicalism. Because when you go to Notre Dame, there's a million interactives. You light a candle and you pray and you intercede for your loved ones. That's an interactive. You can take a prayer and write it down and place it in a vial of sand, and that's an interactive. If you go to Jerusalem and you can roll up a prayer and put it into the Wailing Wall and pray at the wall, that's an interactive. An interactive is just a thing you do. It's a way you do a prayer thing. And those are often really, really meaningful. So we've burned prayers and dissolved prayers and written prayers and put prayers in sand. And some of my favorite interactives were we did a series of games. And we created an archetypes board game that was a spiritual development game. It worked kind of like a combination of chess and checkers, and you had, it was designed for two people, and each of you had different chess pieces, and your chess pieces represented different kinds of spiritual people. So, worshipers and intellectuals and social justice advocates, and those pieces could only move on the chessboard in a certain way. So maybe, your social justice warrior could only move like a knight, or your worshiper could only move like a bishop, that kind of thing. And they had to perform spiritual challenges. So, your social justice warrior would move, and then they would draw a card that was a spiritual challenge, and then they had to roll to see if they were successful in this challenge. And, the challenges were random, so meaning everybody could get the same kind of card. So the social justice warrior might take a card, and that card was like, feed the homeless. And so a social justice warrior would only need to roll, let's say, a 2 in order to be successful in that challenge, but a worshiper would need to roll a 6 because that's not something they would naturally do. And then if you, were successful, then you could go again. And the point was you were trying to get to the center of the square or the center of the board, at which point you'd sort of level up and you'd be able to get a double height tile. And the idea was to get all of your pieces on the board into the center and sort of graduate into spiritual maturity. And that was a really fun exercise. We also made a Fruit of the Spirit tchotchke, which is a little desktop thing, and it was really beautiful. It was made out of lamp finials and mahogany, and each one of the fruits of the Spirit had a triangle that spun around the finial, and so there was a love triangle, and there was a peace triangle, and there was a joy triangle, and you would every morning sort of look at it on your kitchen window, and you could rotate the triangle to say, here's an area where I need to focus on, here's an area where I feel like God's grace is really winning in me right now, or here's an area where I feel like I've been the recipient of this. So, if somebody did something really loving to you yesterday, you might rotate your love triangle so that it says, I was the recipient of great love yesterday. Or if you realize you've been grumpy and loveless, you might rotate that triangle to the side that says, this is an area of ambition. So that was a really cool game. We also had these dice, holy rollers, we called them, and it was just a way to gamify spiritual formation. So you'd roll the dice, and it would give you, a number, and then it would, on one of the dice, that was how many times you had to do a thing, and then it would give you a spiritual exercise, memorize the scripture. So you might roll a 2 and memorize the scripture. So you're going to memorize 2 verses of scripture, or you got to pray for 2 minutes, or you got to post 2 affirmations online or something like that. And then there was always a medium, that you would journal about these 2 verses of scripture that you memorized, or you'd make a post on social media about these 2. And that was a really cool way to do daily devotions. And then my favorite one were these glimpse cards that we made that we now use in our tea ceremonies at the Chapter House, which are really just a deck of scriptural, just of some of my favorite scriptures. Yeah, but they look like tarot cards. I mean, they're the same size and shape as tarot cards. So sometimes people go nutso because of the shape of the card. You're like, yeah, man, that extra 1.5 inches of length is what makes a thing demonic. I don't understand. It's the Bible. How do you make the Bible demonic? I don't know, but some evangelicals can. And it's weird. Anyway, these are some of the great things we did. I think, though, my favorite interactive was for a series we did on happiness, and I'd recently gone to this cool pub in Portland, Oregon, that was all designed to look like a church. I think it might even have been called Church. And you go in there was like a confession booth where it was a selfie station, and everybody dressed up like monks and nuns and this kind of thing, and but they had these wooden menus that was just 1/8-inch plywood held together with fancy clasps, and the logo of the restaurant was burned into it. So we did something similar. We burned the logo of the church into it, filled these wooden menus full of paper so that it was like a wooden book. And everybody that came to church for this series on the Adventure of Happiness got one of these menus. We called it a menu just by accident because that's where we got the idea from, but it was really just a wooden book. And we gave them things to write, like here's some spiritual exercises to do, to journal in this book. Here's the notes you want to take. Here's the scripture you want to write down. And we encouraged everybody to fill up at least one spread, 2 pages in the wooden book. And then the idea was that they would not take it home. Instead, they would return the wooden book to us, and the next week they would come back and be given a different wooden book, so that they were then encouraged to read what the other people had written the previous week and add their own thoughts to it as a living, breathing community journal. And that was a really cool experience that was both very meaningful and very frustrating for people, because most people wanted to keep their menu, and we let everybody keep one of the wooden books at the end of the series, but people were so hacked off that they couldn't find whatever smart, beautiful, amazing thing they'd written once upon a time, because there's like 1,000 of them, but that was a really cool interactive. Well, we did all kinds of stuff, man. Large scale art projects and paintings, huge Howard Finster-esque folk art portrayals. We did cards about the meaning of worship, similar to our daily bread. We did blessing cards. We did any number of things, dressing up in goofy costumes, coming to church on Christmas Day in our pajamas, or in Halloween costumes on Halloween. And we made our own advent calendar with funny church-specific gifts inside that we sold for a fundraiser. We also, on Christmas Eve one year, we had soap made. My friend Gary makes soap. That's his little business. And so I said, could you make me soap with gold, frankincense, and myrrh in it? So for Christmas Eve, we gave everybody a bar of soap that had actual flakes of gold and frankincense and myrrh, which was just really neat. Was the most disgusting soap. It was black, first of all, and then when it got wet, it got sort of gummy. And so Gary was embarrassed that we gave this to everybody. But it was sort of fun. It was memorable. I think I still have a bar somewhere. I'm a little scared to unwrap it, but that was all of these things. Again, the reason we do all of this is because it adds to the embodiment and the memorabilia of the faith. I mean, people remember these things and so many more. I still have people coming up to me at Target or at Walmart, at the gas station, saying, "Oh my gosh, I remember going to your church and you did this." Or I have people email me and say, "Oh my gosh, I just heard that you used to do this. Is this true? Did you really do this?" I mean, this is why we were in the Wall Street Journal. This is why we were on CNN. This is why we were in Time Magazine. This is why we're in the New York Times. It's all for stuff like this, because the truth is that it matters. This stuff sort of sneaks past people's spiritual defenses and move beyond dogma into real transformational encounters with God. And part of the reason, like I mentioned, is that all this stuff tells a story. Tells a story about who God is and what God's doing in the world and what God's doing with us. And like I say, every time I use the word story, I'm immediately thinking of the acronym DARK, that every character has a desire, that they're going to take action, they're going to hit resistance, and they're going to be kicked into a new episode of their life. And of course, there's more to storytelling than that, so much more. But that's the very basics of how to tell a great story. Just the very, 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 very basics. So if you follow the DARK acronym and wonder why your story is not great, there could be 10,000 other reasons. I mean, that's really, in the alphabet of storytelling, that's we haven't got the A yet. That's just And so, but it's a great starting point. And so when we talk about storytelling and design, I just thought, in addition to DARK, here's some things you might consider. So storytelling and media design, you also want to just be aware that the way you use media tells a story. So you got to think about what kind of story you're telling. I mean, if you use no media, that tells a story. If you only use TikTok, that tells a certain kind of story. I mean, just the medium tells its own story, or the lack or combination of mediums. If your church uses tons of media, that tells its own kind of story. And then in context of that, you want to think about how you tell stories in church. You're using visual illustrations. You can display images, graphics, or videos that visually represent a biblical story, a parable, a theme. You want to think about environmental enhancements. Can you use media to create immersive environments using projection mapping or videos that relate to the theme of the story being told during the service, especially in ways that break the fourth wall, that aren't just shooting video on a screen? Can you have multimedia presentations, combining visual elements, audio and video to effectively communicate stories, stuff like testimonies, documentary-style videos, VJing, multimedia sermon illustrations, etc.? Can you use AI technology to serve as a sparring partner? There's just lots of ways that you can use media to flesh out a presentation. You can use media to support a sermon, visual aids like images, graphs, charts, etc. You can have media an essential part of creative worship experiences, multimedia performances, artistic expressions, multimedia prayer experiences, or have media be with interactive elements, exhibits that are altered based on the participants' choices and engagements. This can be as simple as a poll that you use or a community blog that you post that's in the room that people contribute to, or it can be something crazy like touchscreens and VR. All that stuff is really affordable and accessible right now. You can make your own holograms, you can make your own prisms, you can make anything. But everything that you make and everything that you do tells a story. So I just listed off, 20 different things you could do. If you're a church that does all of those, you're telling a certain kind of story to your people. Your people are very unlikely to be worried about the effects of technology on faith. Instead, your people are much more likely to understand how technology can be appropriated and used for faith. If you're a church that's terrified about these things and would never do them, and you're only going to read your hymn lyrics off an overhead projector, well, then you probably are telling a different kind of story about design. So just think, the storytelling in media design consists of not only what story the media tells when you choose to tell a story, but the media itself tells a story, and your use of the media tells a story. And so lots of issues there for you to think of. And of course, it could probably be its own podcast, but we're just wetting your whistle, man. We just want you to be excited about the fun things that God is doing. Similarly, with graphic design, there's different ways to tell a story with graphic design, and the same principles apply. The kind of medium tells a story, the way you use that medium tells a story, and the story you choose to tell has its own story. And you can use graphic designs, and you ought to think about it like a visual hierarchy, meaning like how you're guiding the viewer's attention with color and form and shape and font size. Imagery and illustrations. Think about typography. Think about colors and mood, layout and composition, text and copywriting, branding and identity, interactive elements, media and context. All these things are the things that you consider when you consider the graphic design of your church. And that's both for signs and for the graphic elements in the auditorium. You ought to have somebody who thinks through that stuff, because visuals tell a story. And there's a whole different kind of story between the punk stylings of Banksy or the haute couture of Balagencia. Those are different stories being told. So what story is your church telling? And how are you telling it through the graphics? And then there's also storytelling in environmental design, the way that our space tells a story. Like the site selection is a big one. A Good Friday service outside on a mountaintop tells a different story than a Good Friday service in a shopping mall on a merry-go-round. They just tell different stories. Architectural design is another consideration. The layout and flow tells a story. Like, it told a story when I didn't have any concerns for otherly abled people in our Jeremiah series in the Bedouin tent. I didn't mean to tell a story, but I told one. I told a story about the fact that you better be able-bodied in order to worship here, or we haven't thought about you, because I was an idiot and I didn't know any better. Accessibility is really a big key. Spatial design and theme is a key. Visual elements are a key. Furnishing and artifacts, sound and music, multimedia and technology. Think about all these things, because whether you use them or not tells a story. How you use them tells a story. The story you choose to tell is important, and the way it all works together is important. And so you think if you're constantly telling all of these stories, you got a whole conversation that people are stepping into when they come into your church. And that conversation is happening whether you intend it or not. So what I'm advocating for is not greater complexity, but greater intentionality. I don't think you need to be worried about thinking through all these things and imagining that it will become too cumbersome. It might become cumbersome for you, but most of these things are felt before they're ever thought in the minds of your people. And so when you do all this work to make things feel cohesive and beautiful and friendly and welcoming and hospitable, and people come in and go, oh, that's really nice, you're going to go, oh my gosh, do you have any idea how much work it takes to make this really nice? And just know that's the plight of designers everywhere. The designer at JCPenney feels that way. The designer at Ford Field feels that way. The designer of the Washington Monument feels that way. Everybody who painstakingly, laboriously does the work of design, including what's his name? God, feels that way. And nobody appreciates the amount of work that went into it, and nor could they, nor can they. So just do the work because the work matters, and love the work. Let the work be its own reward, because it is. It's amazing. All right. If you want to stop listening, I won't blame you, because we're about to get into the weeds, bruh. But when we talk about design, I think the most amazing things are possible if we want to think on a slightly deeper level. And that's going to require some familiarity with some key terms. An agent, that's the person that's doing a thing. A patient, that's the person that's having a thing done to them. An association, which is like a mental connection. Like I associate the Nike swoosh with basketball and with Michael Jordan and with victory. I associate the cross with Christianity. I associate a light bulb with Thomas Edison and illumination. And a token. A token is a thing. A communion wafer is a thing. A 25-cent piece is a thing. A pen is a thing. So when you really think about all the stuff that goes on in the church, there's always going to be somebody that's an agent. There's always going to be somebody that's a patient. There's always going to be associations that can be made. There's always going to be tokens. These are kind of the raw materials of interactivity and engagement. And again, this is from the chapter 17.3, interactivity, and then now next, starting on page, 490 or something. But I just thought I'd walk through this because this is a thing that people often go, dude, I didn't get what you were saying there. And it seems like that's really rich material for thinking about design. And oh, brother, is it? Now, each of these things, agents and patients and associations and tokens, they're fluid. So sometimes you are the agent, and sometimes you are the patient, and sometimes you're both the agent and the patient. So what I want to do is read these chapters and make comments as we go along. And again, if you want to pick up the book and read it, I think just this section is worth whatever it is, $10 or whatever you're going to pay online. In the event that you're both the agent and the patient, you get the joy of making things up as you go along, becoming a spectator of your own effort. So I'm talking about interactives or spiritual experiences where you're both the person doing something and you're the person having something done to you. For instance, after introducing the Christian history of rosaries, we invited people to create mala bracelets, necklaces, and other jewelry. The experience was fun, but also meaningful on account of the direct association with the teaching. And it's this connection that makes interactives either a distraction or a delight, since meaningless interactives will often feel like a waste of time. So here, you're the person doing something, and you're the person having something done to them, because you're the one making the bracelet, and then you're the one wearing the bracelet. And of course, you could make a bracelet and then give it to somebody else, in which case now they're the patient, but you're still the agent, but you get the idea. When you're the agent, meaning you're the person doing something, and the associations are the patients, meaning the associations are being done to, then we're inviting you to create something using known symbols. So we used a hashtag, what's the good news, and invited people to take photos of anything, anywhere they felt embodied the gospel. So in this way, like if I take a photo of this coffee cup and I say, what's the good news, hashtag what's the good news, hashtag gospel, I can tell you a whole gospel message of coffee. Whether about the trade of coffee beans. I can tell you a gospel message about my friend Dave Wallstead, who through Uganda Shoe Trees employs Ugandan coffee farmers as part of a gospel project. I can tell you about the gospel of sharing a cup of coffee with a friend, but I'm making those associations just by virtue of seeing this cup of coffee. When you're the agent and tokens are the patients, meaning the thing is the patient, we're asking you to make the invisible visible. So you're creating personifications or fantastical renderings, anything imaginary, like drawing a picture of a unicorn or diagramming the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I already mentioned Egyptian hieroglyphs, but that's a way that you're thingifying the faith. And again, the point of this grid, the point of this whole section is to let you know that sometimes we keep trying new ideas, but they're all the same kind of idea. And so like we have the same kind of ideas where we're the agent and the patient, and the ideas might be very different, but they feel the same and we're not sure why. So like if one week you make mala bead jewelry, and the next week you give yourself a henna tattoo, and the third week you give yourself a makeover, you're like, why do these things all feel the same? Well, they're all cosmetic, yeah, but that doesn't feel quite right. I mean, like if the week after that you design yourself a workout program, that's not cosmetic anymore, but it still feels the same, and it feels the same because you're still the agent and the patient. And that's what really I was trying to get into, and I was really helped by a book called Art and Agency that teases this, Art and Anthropology that teases out this whole idea. What is art agency? It's Howard Glazell, I think. But anyway, it teases out this whole idea of agents and patients and tokens and associations. When you're the agent and the other people around you are the patients, we supply a platform to showcase your unique offerings and creativity to an audience. So this is the normal mode of art. You know, if I paint a picture and I show it to you, I'm the agent, you're the patient, you're having something done to you. And we allow you to preach, so to speak, through your artwork or through your behaviors. Now, there's times when the associations are the agents. So you're providing opportunities to offer something in response to the Spirit's guidance. So we want you to react personally when God tells you to make this or do this or say this. And we prompt you to offer apologies or words of affirmation, you know, like in a sermon. So the thing that's happening is not just that you're hearing a message and you got a thing to do, but now the association that you come up with in your mind is what's driving you to do it. So we ask you to think about a time in your life where you hurt somebody. You make that association in your mind, and now the association is active, telling you, you got to go back and make amends. When the associations are both agents and patients, that's something like where we're inviting people to become both the creator and the artifact. Ash Wednesday is a good example, where you receive the sign of the cross and then also display it as you move through life. We did something similar on Good Friday when we invited people to draw red circles on their wrists or in the palm of their hands in emulation of Christ's wounds. And again, you're saying you're displaying this association. The association is something that you conjure up and it drives you to take a particular action, and then the association itself is sort of being done. When the associations are the agents and the tokens are the patients, we're attaching extraordinary significance to ordinary objects, maybe like the glimpse cards that we made, or the way we ask people to wonder what God might be saying to them as they stare at an icon or prayer beads. And the point of these examples is to recognize that God might speak to you through something that doesn't speak on its own. Again, this stone can remind me of the Wailing Wall. This stone in the wall can remind me of Golgotha. This stone is a thing, and the association in my mind gives this stone significance. Without that association, the stone is just a thing. With the association being active, now the stone can speak. So like if you make a rock altar and you hold up significance to, you know, the little river stones or river rocks that everybody's got, that's the association that has power there. The people make up the association or find the association, then it begins to speak. When the associations are the agents and they, meaning the other people in the room, are patients, we're creating something that subverts the audience sense of self-possession. making them feel something they didn't choose. So you've heard of people, this is an old common one, placing an open common in an open coffin in display on a public area. And then when people peer into the casket, they see their own reflection on a mirror. And this reminds them of their mortality. So this kind of stunt startles people into recognizing that, oh, that's not just a casket. They make the association, that's my casket, and they're the recipient of what's going on, and it jars them in a different way. Now, when the tokens are the agents and you are the patient, meaning when the thing does something to you, we're talking about opportunities for you to create representations, reenactments, and embodiments of significant spiritual events. So here we let you make history. We give you something historical, like scenes from the Bible or great moments you got to see or create, and we allow you to bring it to life in that instant with those around you using the materials at hand. The most obvious example is communion, wherein we invite people to partake of an ancient ritual in which they relive the life of Christ, bringing Christ into themselves. Culinary communion is a favorite idea where we replace the traditional elements of bread and wine with hors d'oeuvres, prepared on stage by a selection of chefs. But again, the thing is doing something to you. You're ingesting Christ. When the tokens are the agents and the associations are the patients, then we're dealing with scenarios that invite people to participate with classic Christian emblems, albeit in a new way. So they're writing specific sins of which we're guilty, then nailing them to the good cross. That's an example. Inviting our people to be like Pilate and wash their hands of Christ's blood. Okay, so then them just, and we added a chemical to the water, so when they dipped their hands in it, their hands got stained red. But the red is nothing without the association. So the token is the agent, the water is the thing doing it, the dye is the thing doing it, but the association in their mind is being sort of revealed upon them. Now, when the tokens are both the agents and the patients, we're supplying participants with mirrors to ruminate without flattery, enhancement, or optimization. So you are the thing that you got to think about. A video confessional is a good example where people sit in the booth and stare at an iPad. They have to watch themselves and consider what they've done, then they share that with somebody else. Or maybe the illustration I used earlier about staring into the chest of Gomer, which has now been replaced with a mirror because A, we're all complicit in the sins of Gomer, and B, we as a community of Christian people did great violence to this mannequin, and you're part of the reason we had to cut Gomer's boobs off. But the whole idea, again, is that you got to think about you, and you're the one scrutinizing yourself. When the tokens are the agent and the other people in the room are the patients, then we're creating immersive environments where participants feel as though they're part of the cast rather than spectators. Liturgical readings are a good instance of this category of interactivity, kind of a call and response thing. Kyrie is a good example of that. Now, when they, meaning the other people in the room, are the agents and you're the patient, we're providing space for you to acknowledge the good other people have performed. Here, the past actions of somebody else are the driving force behind what you're required to do. If a favorite basketball coach is present, a former player may seek out their coach in order to thank them for their investment. Again, here, you're just waiting for somebody to do something to you. And they are the active party and you are the passive party. So when you go up to the front of the church, you're just waiting to receive prayer and then you receive it. You're the patient. You're the one receiving healing. When they are the agents and the associations of the patients, then we're thinking about inviting people to use their own perceptions and interpretations and rationalizations to create meaning. This can happen exegetically, like when we displayed the book of Mark all over our auditorium and allowed people to scribble their thoughts in the margins. It can happen semiotically, like when we created origami birds and asked people to write something on it that they would like to set free. We're giving guidelines here about what can be contributed, enjoyed, or received. Like in our cross garden area in front of the church, I was very proud of that I designed. I used to, when I would travel extensively, I'd always buy crosses. And I had all these crosses in my office. I didn't know what to do with them. So we put them in a little cross garden that was a very small scale representation of the amazing hill of crosses in Lithuania. And I used to go and smoke my pipe and and pray in the little cross garden. I loved it. I loved it. But in our cross garden, we limit installations to only crucifixes, because the people that put stuff in are the agents, and then the associations are constantly with the ones driven by the crucifix and images of suffering and death and salvation, etc. When they are the agents and the tokens are the patients, then we're inviting you to create a symbolic substitute for a person, place, or thing. We imbue that symbol with meaning, performing actions upon it as a means of engaging the assigned value and virtue or significance. Youth groups love these interactives, like getting teenagers to burn their music as a demonstration of leaving their old behind. Or like when people deface a portrait or venerate an icon, they're doing something to a thing as a demonstration of what they wish they could do to the real person. Performing random acts of kindness is also a kind of substitute, in the sense that we're loving our unknown neighbor because we're in love with our unseen God. And again, this is when the thing, probably this is when the people have the power and the thing is just the recipient. When they are both the patients and the agents, we allow people to act as patrons, enjoying their contributions intrinsically. This might include like making their own souvenirs or takeaways or tchotchkes, or invite them to play with art supplies or musical instruments. But again, they're doing both. They're doing both, and they're doing stuff to themselves and for themselves. Now, this is a really extensive grid. The whole point of teasing out that grid was to be able to chart through how often we do the same kinds of things so that we don't get too samey. Because again, every time you repeat an idea, you lessen the emotional and ministerial impact of that idea by 50%. The obverse is eventually true, that if you take communion every day for, 7,000 days, then the ritualistic participation in communion becomes meaningful. But most of us are never going to be that committed to one thing. We're just going to do the same Easter cantata every year for a decade, and it'll become boring. So you want things to stay fresh and stay lively, which means you got to change them up. But of course, our imaginations are limited, so we end up getting caught into ruts and things feel too samey. So that's why we developed this grid, is to go, all right, here's 16 different categories of interactives. Let's plot out what the last 10 have been, and let's plot out, and then figure out where the gaps are. We haven't done anything like this. We haven't done anything where they're both the agents and the patients. We haven't done anything where the tokens are the agents and the associations are the patients. We haven't done any of that stuff for a hot minute. Let's dream and imagine something that'll sort of satisfy those components of the equation. And the truth is, rarely do we get anything perfectly right. It's just a way to imagine something new so that we can get out of our ruts and keep creating fresh things. And again, the reason that I've been so successful in my life with these kinds of experiences is because of my deep-seated conviction that you change always for the sake of change, just to stay fresh, and you don't repeat an idea. And so as a result of me constantly striving towards new experiments and new forays into new theologies, into new explorations of the biblical text, people have gotten very, very meaningful encounters with the Holy Spirit, and my own life has been tremendously enriched. I never got bored at church. I never got bored at church I was in charge of. Maybe that's true for a lot of people. Anyway, lots more that we could say about that, but of course we're running long. I just want you guys to know, I think design matters, and there's a great playground of festivity enjoyment for you and for me when we cooperate with God in these kinds of ways. Grace and peace, everybody. We'll see you next week.